So, hello everybody. Let me warmly welcome you in one of in our final lecture in this semester before the summer break, and I'm quite glad to welcome you, physically here again, and as well as online. And I hope that you guys can see me online too. Let me start with a quick introduction of our dear guest, Hojjat Darabi. He's assistant professor at the Razi University in Kermanshah, Iran. And he is with us in these months as a grantee of the Joint Excellence and Social Sciences and Humanities program of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And we're quite happy to have him here, because we have the chance to conduct collaborative research with him together. Especially Dr. Michael Brandl is working with Hojjat on questions of raw materials, and especially lithic raw materials in the Zagros area. Well, Hojjat has already some international career behind him. He did his master thesis already on the Neolithic topic, his PhD thesis too, at the university in Tehran on the topic, the reassessment of the Neolithization process of the central Zagros, past approaches and future directions. And this is already published as a book in the International Bar series. He was also a postdoc in Copenhagen in the famous department of Mortensen and Richter, where he is still an affiliated researcher at the University of Copenhagen. He had a lecturer position at the university in Kashan, Iran, and is now assistant professor in Kermanshah. He has several research projects, all more or less related with different aspects of the Neolithic in West and Southwest Iran. He's an expert on pottery, also on lithics, stone vessels, etc. He's working with lots of different methods in the field. He co-directed several excavations. Let me mention Chogha Golan and the famous Ganj Dareh, together with the Danish colleagues, and he's now directing the new sounding in Remre in the Mekhan Plain in southwest Iran. So we are quite happy to have him here, and that he's spending his time with us, and he's giving us a lecture today about the creative millennia transition to the Neolithic in central Zagros. Please, Hojjat.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for your kind introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm very delighted to be here among my Austrian colleagues at this very interesting academic area at the Austrian Archaeological Institute. So first of all, I would like to be thankful to my colleagues. If I can go on to the, okay. Professor Barbara Horich, the director of the institute, and her colleagues at the institute who were very helpful and provided me with this opportunity to talk about the Neolithic transition in the central Zagros of Iran, and other colleagues who have been helpful with my visit as a research fellow at the institute. In this talk, I'm gonna address two main questions, as you see here.
There's no sound.
Me?
Yes,
Okay,
let's try
sorry.
again. Now?
Okay, I suppose they should hear
No
me right
sound.
now. Okay, okay, yes. I'm
No, it's
sorry.
okay.
Okay, sorry. We forgot to.
Okay. So let's try again. We
Okay,
start
okay.
from the beginning. I'm sorry, and I would like to leave the Vollbild modus here, otherwise we can't see the others. Wo ist das hier? Warum muss immer ich das machen? So, we start from the beginning and we start now, please.
Okay, maybe I should move this. The upper part of the slide. Okay, let us start again from the beginning, because our online audience, they didn't hear me. So I'm going to talk about the Neolithic transition in the central Zagros, what I call it, or rather said as a recreating millennia. And I'll tell you why I'm calling this as a creating millennia in the central Zagros of Iran. Oh, okay, got it. So I need to be thankful, because I need to start again, to my colleagues, as you see here, their name here for the online audience. I'm sorry. At least you have their name here. So and I'm gonna address these two questions you see here on this slide, and talk about these themes. So let's move on to the next slide. When we look at the Neolithic period, especially the transitional Neolithic, or what is called in the Neolithic archaeology of the Near East or let's say West Asia, not Near East and Near East, or sometimes Southwest Asia, we see actually different or a mosaic of Neolithization process. The first one is the southern central Levant and the upper Euphrates River and upper Tigris River in southeastern Turkey, western Zagros or Iraqi Kurdistan, and central Zagros of Iran, and central Anatolia. When we compare, I mean, this whole region, especially both wings, the western and eastern wings of the Fertile Kherson, the Levant in particular, and the Zagros and Taurus, at least eastern Taurus and the Zagros. When we compare these together in terms of different archaeological materials, we found them in some cases, let me say in most cases, different. You see that in the Levant, you can find a continuation, a sort of continuation from late Epipaleolithic onward into the early Neolithic period. At the same time, you don't have the same continuation. That's why I call it that we see a sharp boundary between Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic in the central Zagros. Of course, if we put aside a little bit the chipped stone industry, in which we can see some sort of continuation in some techno-typological criteria. This kind of distinct cultural trajectory is also attested by the subsistence strategy with regard to plant exploitation at both Western and Eastern Fertile Kherson. In Eastern Fertile Kherson, crop progenitors input are low, of course, cereals, and at the same time, we have high exploitation of legumes and nuts. And in Western Fertile Kherson, while we have higher exploitation of wild progenitive of crops. And this was previously investigated by different materials, different archaeological materials, which was published in this book in 2005, where you see that, so they divided the whole West Asia into different territories, boundaries, and culture during the Neolithic period. Based on that, that's why I believe that we're not able archaeologically to use those Levantine chronological, Levantine approach, Levantine chronological terminology when we are dealing with the Eastern Fertile Kherson, specifically the Zagros region. Okay, this map shows the main or key, the late Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic site across the Zagros from north west to the southeast direction. And this is the central Zagros, what we call it archaeologically, the central Zagros of Iran here, which is highlighted. Which is geologically composed of mostly this landscape, ridges and with intermountain valleys and plain. This photo I took them a few days ago when I flew from Iran in the Zagros to the capital Tehran, but unfortunately, I'm sorry if they are not so clean because the weather is so dusty every day. This is going to be a very bad environmental disaster in the Zagros for the Iranian and Iraqi people who are living there. So let me talk about the research history of the Iranian Zagros a little bit. The first question-laden, question-oriented project was directed by the American archaeologist Robert John Braidwood, who actually, after his long project in Iraqi Kurdistan in the 1940s and 50s, actually because he couldn't continue his Iraqi project, so he was invited by the Iranian archaeologist, Dr. Izzatullah Nigahban, to the central Zagros of Iran because in terms of landscape, they were the same. That's why he decided to come to Iran to carry on his own project in Iranian Zagros. So he came to Kermanshah with 3 Austrian jeeps to do his investigation. And he spent 9 months in Kermanshah, in the city of Kermanshah, doing archaeological survey. And also he did some excavation at different sites from Paleolithic onward and Neolithic into late Chalcolithic period, in which you see that some of his excavation, for example, at Warbasi, the very important, well-known Paleolithic site, which is seen on the left hand on top, and also the site of Asiab and Sarah. But unfortunately, in spite of his Iraqi Kurdistan, he never published his Iranian project, actually. So we have only a few pages of information published by him and actually and his team. But I believe that he paved the ground very well because he used the first interdisciplinary research in not only in terms of the Iranian archaeology, but also in terms of the history of archaeology all across the whole world, using the first actually scientific approach dealing with archaeological issues. In the 1960s, actually, when he left the Iranian Zagros into southeastern Turkey and continued his project there, But he actually opened the way, or paved the way for his students, Frankel and Flannery, who directed their excavation and investigation in southwestern Iran, particularly in the Dehleran Plain, and some other younger archaeologists who excavated, for example, Danish archaeology, Professor Peter Mortensen, who excavated the very important site of Tapaguran in the Holeilan Valley, and the Canadian archaeologists who undertook a long excavation project at the site, a very well-known site of Ganj Dareh in western Iran. After that, in the late 1970s and 1980s, actually, due to some political unrest, in particular the Iran-Iraq war, so no fieldwork, archaeological fieldwork undertaken in the central Zagros, as the region became the battlefield between these two countries in that time. That's why archaeological focus or research shifted to the western or the Levant, western fertile Kherson, first in the Levant, and then after that in the 1990s and the early 20s in southeastern Turkey. But in terms of the Turkish archaeological project, they were mostly actually based on the rescue archaeological project because of the so many dam construction they had on the tributaries of Euphrates and Tigris there. In the early 20s, the significance of the Zagros region in archaeology, in Neolithic archaeology, was highlighted by this American zoologist, zooarchaeologist, Melinda Zider, who actually reanalyzed those collections previously excavated before the Iranian Revolution and published them very well in different important informative publication papers. She also did some new chronology based on new radiocarbon dates, which is very important, which was very, very important contribution to the Neolithic archaeology of the region. So after a sort of 3 decades of gap in archaeological fieldwork, we see that the first fieldwork was reopened by the Iranian and non-Iranian archaeologists. In this case, the first one was in 2008 by the British Iranian team who excavated the site of Sheikhi Abad in that corner to the left up. And also the German Iranian archaeologists did some brief excavation in 2008 and 9 and 10 at the site of Chogha Golan. And also some rescue archaeology at the site of Asiab, which I directed in this excavation in 2009, in the early 2009. But this site is unfortunately no longer available and gone forever because it is flooded after that excavation. So a few years later, in 2016, an Iranian and Danish project was established and was co-directed by my Danish colleagues, Tobias Richter, Peter Mortensen, and myself. So during that project, we could actually revisit some important Neolithic and Epipaleolithic site, in particular the site of Ganj Dareh, Asiab, and the Epipaleolithic site of Chogha Golan here. You see some of those general photo of the site during our excavation in between 2016 and 2019. So this all information, new investigation, whether fieldwork or post-fieldwork studies actually built the Zagros, I believe, out of shadow in terms of archaeological information about the Neolithic period. And especially with regard to the initial evidence of early domestication of plants and animal, the beginning of farming. In this map, you see the location of the main distribution of the main Epipaleolithic site across the Zagros and the central Zagros, which is highlighted here. When we look at these actually, and we compare these sites in terms of their location with those later Neolithic sites, which I will show in the next slide here, you found them completely different. So the Epipaleolithic of the Zagros is a sort of a continuation of Upper Paleolithic. So in terms of lithic, even lithic industry, it is believed that it was developed out of the what is called as the Barbadoosian, or the industry of Upper Paleolithic lithic industry. The Darzian in this case, the lithic Epipaleolithic lithic industry of this region. In other cases, for example, in terms of nature of occupation, still the cases are under occupation when you compare it to the Levant, where you have at the same time during late Epipaleolithic, you see that they've actually some early sedentary life actually firm during the Natufian period, but we don't see the same thing in the Zagros. In terms of subsistence strategy, you still see that hunting and gathering, foraging, again, exactly like what happened during the Paleolithic. So I believe that it was completely, more or less, it was a sort of continuity in different things, actually with regard to the Epipaleolithic of the Zagros, at least up to now, based on our available evidence. Okay, when we look at the paleoclimatic information of the region, which is based mostly on the Lake Zaribab between Iraqi and Iranian and Iraqi border, so and some other newly studied location, again, which of course their information more or less in line with those previously published from paleoclimatic information. We see that after the Younger Dryas, which was between 11,000 and let's say 9,800, 700 BC, not BP, BC. So we see that the environment based on the pollen that we have from this location in the region, in the central Zagros, the Iranian Zagros at all, that we see different change actually. So pistachia and oak trees increase, they grow increasingly through time. At the same time, we see that Chenopodium and Artemisia, they actually became less and less present. This indicated a sort of climatic change in the environment, and thereby an environmental change happened after the Younger Dryas, which is around early the 10th millennium BC. Interestingly, exactly this is the time that we see the initial or the beginning of new occupation in the region. This map shows the early Neolithic site of the Zagros. Unfortunately, the upper one is hidden by that band, which is Sheikhi Abad. So in the 10th millennium BC, we have Sheikhi Abad, Asiab, and Chogha Golan, these three sites. But in the 9th millennium, they were some new site added to them. Gazanchi, Jani, Asiab, and this a newly excavated site, which was briefly, of course, excavated, Kalakas of Murad, very close to the same era, river. And around 8000 BC, we have the establishment of these two newly established sites, Ganj Dareh and Holocene. And later on, in the 8th millennium BC, we have Guran, Chogha Sefid, and Ali Kosh. So I will come back to this, actually, this sort of settlement change in the region from highland to lowland later on. This is the latest and the most updated, based on my own information, of course, chronological chart of the region. And this is the time period that I'm addressing here transitional Neolithic between 9,800 BC, 700, 800 BC, and 7,000 BC, which I call it and divided as a transitional Neolithic and early Neolithic period. So when we look at the nature of the occupation of the early Neolithic, both transitional and early Neolithic site in the region, we see a sort of general change in this case. At the basal level of all those sites that I mentioned in the previous slide I showed you, we have only ash layers at the bottom, which was then in the upper levels, in the later level, change, and we have this very solid, very tangible, very strong, very solid evidence of architecture. I believe that this can show us a sort of change or in the nature of occupation from seasonal occupation, from very short-term occupation into actually semi-sedentary and finally sedentary life in the region. This can be also shown at the site of Chogha Golan. Again, if you look at this stratigraphic sketch on the left, you see a base ash deposit, and then the first architectural remains then appear through the sequence upward. And the upper level, if you look at this, you have clay walls of the sheet of Pisa and perhaps in some cases of mud bricks. In between, actually, you see the different types of grinding stone mortars, pestle, and so on. Actually, that can be taken as a sort of sedentaries in the region. When we look at the stratigraphic information of Asiab, a site that was established in the early 9th millennium BC and then continued the occupation there until the end of PPN at around 7,000 BC, we have the same thing, ash deposit at the bottom and then non-ash deposit with architectural remains. And in this case, you see that an in situ mortar, which is set in the floor. Okay, and when we are talking about Ganj Dareh, a site that was established at the end of the 9th millennium BC and then continued until around the mid of 8th millennium BC, we don't see this change. Here we have from the bottom until the uppermost level, only architectural remains completely one after another firm. This, based on our new excavation at site, we believe that the site was never abandoned. It was completely continuously under occupation from one generation to another. That's why I recently actually tried to suggest this sort of diagram, explanatory diagram to explain the nature of occupation from late Epipaleolithic onward during transitional Neolithic and also early Neolithic period. You see during the transitional Neolithic between this time that I have showed here, that we have mobile hunter-gatherer and maybe mobile herder farmers, which is, of course, I believe this happened in the 9th millennium BC. But during the early Neolithic, we're dealing with the village-based farmer herders and also mobile herder farmers. You see that during the late period, Neolithic period, which was actually in the 7th millennium BC, we see a new event, which was the appearance of nomadic pastoralism. Those people actually were herder and they moved between lowland and highland, and based on archaeological evidence, we can actually push back the beginning of this sort of living type of this lifestyle into the at least 10th millennium BC. When we actually in 2016 revisited the site of Asiab, because its chronology and subsistence was not so clear, During our re-excavation, we not only redocumented those previously excavated part here, in that part here, this was previously excavated by the American archaeologists, but they never published it very well. We opened this new area and we documented that area as well. So we found out this hole, what was called as a pit at the site, actually, when its function was not known at that time. We found that this was one of the earliest built semi-subterranean circular communal building that we already know, actually, in many cases from different sites across the West Asia. Based on those, for example, intentionally placed deposits of animal skull and mandible. In this case, 19 sample of wild boar were completely in the deposit under the floor of this building. And you see the antler were intentionally actually placed into the wall inside, which will follow the internal round shape of the like a bench of Pisa. You see that the newly excavated part by us in 2016, which was, of course, this site was very damaged by the animal borrowing. When we compare this in terms of layout, plan, and some internal actually layout, we see that, for example, in this case, we can compare it to the structure, communal structure of Wadi, Fainan, Jerfalama, and so on. And interestingly, based on our new radiocarbon date, this was built, this structure, this communal structure built around the middle of the 10th millennium BC, that made it as one of the earliest when we compare it chronologically with those similar building in West Asia. So communal building emerged soon after the initial inhabitation of the Zagros, like other nearby region, following climatic optimum, contemporary with those with the Levant and Anatolia. These communal buildings serve as places. It is believed that they were actually places to reach collective argument and played role in social cohesion and managing challenges, as well as mitigating, for example, social or environmental tension, because the people, they have just got a new world. They are experimenting in new things, different things in terms of economy, in terms of social life, and other things in terms of rituality and so on. So they got a sort of tension, and it is believed that these communal buildings, they were used for the people to actually have a meeting and to make their collective mind about those things. And as I mentioned, actually, similarity in plan of this structure that we exposed at the site is very important. And we see, when we look at the whole region, the Iranian Central Zagros, we see a sort of change from communal to private to household ritual area, because in the later the Neolithic site like Ganj Dareh, Sheikhi Abad, we don't find the same communal building. But we see that they've actually, this kind of, for example, animal skull, they were placed in a very small area. It is believed they were used privately, like a private, for example, temple or so on. Okay, let me talk about a little bit about the subsistence strategy of the region during this transitional period. In terms of Chogha Golan, with the state that I've written here, more or less, we have an intensive, in the lowermost layer, of course, intensive use of barley, which is indicating close interaction between human and environment. This is very important, which I look at it again and tell about a little bit more later on. And we have cultivated two raw barley at the site, Immer and Lentin in the 9th millennium BC, but they were not morphologically yet domesticated, but they were cultivated in the 9th millennium BC. In the later or succeeding millennium, the 8th millennium BC, in the beginning of this millennium, the 8th millennium BC, we have the early evidence of the domesticated barley and also Immer. And this is the only site that, as far as I know, with the high abundance, with a very large amount of grinding stone. In this case, and in terms of preservation of plant remains, the site is unique in Iranian Neolithic. And about the East Asiab, we see the same, more or less the same story. Morphologically domesticated Immer and Turlaw barley appeared at around 8000 BC. But again, we have cultivation of those morphologically wild during the 9th millennium BC, and some weedy plant indicating the cultivation at the site during the 9th millennium BC. Also, another indicator of early cultivation of the site is the larger seed through time of the plant at the site. And in terms of Sheikhi Abad, which was of course very briefly excavated, and the excavation was more focused on the upper level, later level of the site, we see that the cultivated two raw barley and possibly Immer, based on the publication that in 2018, you see the publication here, of Immer happened at the site, and presence of wild lentil and pistachia. It is believed that before the 8th millennium BC, because the site seems to have a long sequence from 10th millennium to the 7th millennium BC, to the 8th millennium BC, which is a long sequence of the Neolithic period. It is believed that before the 8th millennium BC, the occupant of the site, they were auditioning or experimenting with those some plants that actually were never domesticated at the site. I put together the available information like this one. At Chogha Golan, we have domestic or cultivation, not domestication, of barley, Immer, in corn, lentil, and some other side. In this case, in some cases, actually, we can talk about it with question mark, of course. When it comes to the evidence related to the animal domestication, at Asiab, we don't have. Based on new excavation finding from the site of Asiab there, which is from the mid-10th millennium BC, of course, we don't have any evidence indicating animal evidence at the site. But the Iranian Zagros issue, which is very important in terms of giving the earliest evidence of domestication of goats, among other animals. We have the earliest evidence based on the kill-off patterns and genetic analysis, and of course some other like hoof prints, which was excavated and found at the site. We have the earliest evidence at the site of Ganj Dareh. No other site actually yet known, more or less actually, with this big evidence, such a big evidence indicating of the earliest evidence of goat domestication at the site. Another actually evidence that can be very helpful in terms of investigating animal domestication in the region is the micromorphological evidence, which is indicating that at around the end of the 9th millennium BC, based on the remains, which was recognized by micromorphological analysis, that we have animal penning, we have animal dung, which is supposed to be from goats at the region. So this can be taken on another evidence of early animal management during the 9th millennium BC in the region. Okay, this is some information that I gathered actually in terms of animal management in the region. So Ganj Dareh and Sheikhi Abad, they show the earliest evidence from the late 9th into early 8th millennium BC. Other side, we don't have up to now actually evidence in this case. Okay, if I conclude of the subsistence strategy of the region, we have between 9,800 and 8,500 BC an intensive interaction between human and wild progenitors of early domesticates. This is the period that I call it the stage of selective hunting, gathering, intensive experimentation, and the period of growing ecological knowledge of the people, and the period of food research management. This was continued by the succeeding period, which seems to have been actually coincided with the low-level food production based on those evidence that I explained here in terms of plant and animal between 8,500 and 8,000 or the early, the beginning of the 8th millennium BC. We see the first evidence of environmental manipulation, but in this period, we don't see any morphological change of plants and animals. And during the later period, 8th millennium BC, we have the same, the evidence of fully domesticated species. It seems that based on the new conclusion that I have, domestication seems to have happened not over the millennia or millennium, but it seems to have happened actually over a century, specifically in the second half of the 9th millennium BC in the region. But before that, we have a period, as I mentioned here, of this experimentation and intensive and interaction between human and environment, which is very important, which was foundation for the domestication of these species by the local people. When we look at the grinding a stone, also it is not, we don't have so much information about the emergence and development technotypologically, and its possible relationship with the subsistence change in the region. But I think that a general change from deep mortar to shallow core shape happened. It's more or less coincided with the development in the subsistence strategy, the plant-based subsistence or plant exploitation in the region. When it comes to the lithic technology, we see that a sort of diachronical change in the region from late Epipaleolithic onward. During the transitional Neolithic in the 10th and 9th millennium BC, we have a combination of both pressure and punch technique. So we have a sort of, in some cases, technotypological criteria, a sort of late Epipaleolithic heritage in this transitional period, which actually we call it as a Primo-Alaphathian recently. And during later period, we have mostly the predominance of what is called the Alaphathian industry, which is actually known by making, in most cases, blade and bladed using pressure technique in the region. Okay, let me a little bit very briefly talk about late PPN, which was which is chronologically coincided with the second half of the 8th millennium BC. We have a sort of shift in the settlement pattern of the region. Abandonment of the key site in the Zagros, Sheikhi Abad, at the top, you can see only the star, unfortunately, and Ganj Dareh and Chogha Golan, those key sites that were under occupation for a very, very long time, at least Chogha Abad, Sheikhi Abad and Chogha Golan. So we see that they were abandoned in the middle, both these sites all more or less in the same period, in the middle of the 8th millennium BC. And at the same time, we have the establishment of occupation, the early occupation of the lowland, nearby lowland. That's why it comes to mind, everybody's actually mind, that a sort of movement of people actually happened here from highland to lowland. But why? We can actually talk about two things. The first one is based on our new and paleo-environmental evidence that we got from the a lake, a wetland near Kermanshah in western Iran. It is believed that the dry, cold, climatic event of what is called as a 9.2, was predominant in the in this period, in the second half of the 8th millennium BC. Perhaps this was a trigger. This caused such an abandonment and a shift of occupation from highland to the nearby lowland. And the other hypothesis, let me say, that is that maybe an environmental depression, but it was an environmental depression, but we're not sure actually that happened because of the climatic change in the region or population increase. This is can be actually addressed in the near archaeological investigation of the region. Anyway, during this period, we see the introduction of obsidian for the first time, obsidian pieces into the Iranian Zagros atoll. And based on our new excavation at the site of Alikut that I directed a few years ago, just a brief stratigraphic excavation, to revisit the chronology and stratigraphy of the site, we have not only the circulation of obsidian as an interregional, as a long distance contact between Neolithic people. We also have a lot of these shell beds, which actually lavishly used in this site as a burial goods, but we don't know actually anything. We hypothesize that they were used as a finished good along the Persian Gulf in the seashore, and then circulated and brought to the site, which of course the site is not so far from the Persian Gulf right now. So, and the finished good to the site. And at the same time, and what we have, which is, of course, our information is not so enough right now, is the domestication of sheep, at least based on the new evidence that the zooarchaeological evidence that we have from Ali Kush and another site which was excavated in southern Zagros. Okay. In terms of Ali Kush, this is the stratigraphic trench that I excavated at the site. We have a deposit around 7 meters at the site from top to the virgin soil. We see a high number of occupational levels, which is completely a different result from what previously published by Frankel, the American archaeologist. Based on our analysis, the isotope analysis done on the human remains, and those are stratigraphic information, we can talk about this issue that the people who actually, at least in the basal level, around the middle of the 8th millennium BC, they were not so actually sedentary. They didn't have any sedentary life. And instead, they were moving around between highland and lowland. They were seemingly more mobile. And based on our new evidence, we can talk about the emergence of pottery at the site, not only this site, but other sites, contemporaneous site in the region, that the pottery emerged at around 7000 BC, which is chronologically in line or consistent with other Neolithic sites in West Asia, or more or less. Okay, let me conclude up my presentation. Transition to the Neolithic was paved by environmental improvement in the 10th millennium BC, and social ritual change predated it is believed, based on our recent new evidence, that change was first happened in rituality and social structure of the people. Before any change, we see any change in the subsistence, the so-called agriculture, the beginning of agriculture in the region. Environmental richness made longer occupation from short-term occupation to longer and longer towards sedentary life in the region. This became possible because of the environmental richness in the region. And transition to the Neolithic coincided with an intensive interaction between human and potentially domesticable species, and increasing inherited ecological knowledge, transmission of knowledge. No evidence also we know from region regarding herding, pre-domestic cultivation during the 10th millennium and early 9th millennium BC. But it is believed most likely that the resource depletion resulted although from climatic change or population increase happened in the 9th millennium BC. This, I believe, this 9th millennium BC, which is the most important period, millennia. And for those who want to focus on the Neolithic period, that during this period, actually, we see the beginning of initial cultivation and animal herding in the region. The early to mid-8th millennium BC saw the first morphological domestic plant and animal species in the region and occupation of, as I mentioned earlier, of the lowland in southwestern Iran. And we see the increased long distance in contact in the second half of this millennium BC. Let me say the last point is that a multiple socioeconomic transformation in the 10th, 8th millennium to 8th millennium of BC, spanning human activities, creativities in the region. As compared with late Epipaleolithic, we see that new features are obviously seen during this new transitional period in the center of Zagros. That's why I call this millennia the creative millennia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Hojjat. Maybe you can change the mode here. In the meanwhile, we start with the discussion and with questions. And I would like to ask the audience both. I would like to ask the audience both the online audience as well as you guys here in the room for questions to Hojjat. Come close.
Okay, sure.
Any questions from the audience? Yes, sure. Please, Katharina Streit.
A small question about the late BBN obsidian trade, because if I understood correctly, you said there isn't actually that much circulation going on, yet you have the obsidian appearing at the site. A, do you know roughly where it comes from, the sourcing data? And B, how did it come there to the trade network?
May I summarize this quickly, because I'm not sure if this was hearable by the audience online. So it's about the obsidian, about the new obsidian network and the potential sources, the related analysis, and the exchange network.
Okay. Please. Yeah, this is a good question actually. So based not only our new evidence, but also we knew that from the at least 1960s done by Renfer for the first time, which is investigation was first mostly based on those samples from this site, from the site of Ali Kush in southwestern Iran. And based on those analysis and also later the sourcing like nutrient activation and so on. So we see that all those obsidian pieces that we have, samples we have in Western Iran, in the Zagros, they brought from mostly from southeastern Turkey, close to Van, Nemrudagh, and Bingöl in particular. And what was your last question?
If I understood correctly, you said that it wasn't really a trade network. So if it wasn't, or maybe I misunderstood. If it wasn't a trade network, what was it there?
Depends how we define trade network, actually. I believe that it happened not directly, for example, from point A to B. So it was circulated between people, you know, from a village, one village to another. We can actually talk about this sort of circulation not only for obsidian, but also for those seashell wheels. Actually, some of them, they, based on some analysis done by the British archaeologists in Iraqi Kurdistan, based on their sample, they were built from somewhere in eastern Iran, from eastern Iran, which is also so far away from that. So how can we explain this? Sometimes it is really difficult actually to imagine how this happened in the past during the Neolithic time when we don't have pack animal. But recently I have seen actually online that some people, they were using goats for transportation as well. So maybe this happened actually, who knows?
Okay, so thank you very much. Yes, the Iranian goats, they were always good for surprises, right? Especially with these early days for domestication. Let me continue with the question. You have shown this fantastic data and architecture from Asiab, this subterranean communal huge building with the deposition of wild boars. And it's interpreted as a ritual communal building. And it's circular, and we know ritual building circular, also dating to this quite early phases, like the famous buildings in Southeast Anatolia. So do you see any relations with this ritual, monumental buildings in Göbekli and other places with what you know now and what you have collected for the Zagros?
Okay, this is, based on some evidence, in particular layout, general layout of this communal building, which is circular, subterranean in shape, in plan, and internal layout in installation of animal deposit and so on. Actually, we can talk about the sort of similarities. So we believe that some, the people actually may have shared some knowledge of how to build this communal building in the 10th millennium BC, which is very important. Because, at the same time, if we put this aside, actually, maybe this is one of those few evidence that by which we can talk about really the social relationship between these two regions, actually, whether it's Eastern Turkey or Euphrates and so on. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Bogdana Milic, please.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering about the Epipaleolithic transition. When you started, I think you were talking about how continuous it is in the Levant and how in the eastern wing sounds like a sharp line between. And then I was wondering what's happening in your opinion then with some stuff in Pars. I remember well from Spain with like Ganj Dareh. Yeah. And for example, new sites in the southeast, like Chogha Golan or there on the edges, and how the evidence is now, I think, altering and now term that is coming again in fashion, proto-Neolithic that has in connection to both Sarsian and Vivian stuff, and then it should be rather like a continuous development of the Epipaleolithic stuff, you say sharp line in between in the central Zagros and then this thing in Pars and upper Zagros and South Ukraine. Would that be different or?
Okay, let me again summarize here for the audience because we still have 23 listeners online too. This is quite an expertise question about the transition from Epipal to PPN, and in particular when we keep in mind the new data that we have now from Southeast Anatolia and from the Fars region, and how Hojjat is thinking about these particular transition, right? Okay.
Okay. Yeah, as I mentioned actually during in my presentation, in case of lithic, if you mean that in case of lithic technology, we have some Epipaleolithic evidence actually going on and still using. They were using during the early pre-pottery Neolithic in the region, but in other cases, I don't see any continuation. For example, in terms of subsistence, you know, when I'm talking about subsistence, that is completely, you know, it shouldn't come to our mind that, for example, foraging. Yeah, foraging happened in 10th and 9th millennium BC. But what actually was focused during this period? We see that caprine were intensively actually hunted and selectively maybe, and some progenitors of wild progenitors of the crops during this period. Those species that were potentially domesticable, that actually they were domesticated at least in the 9th millennium BC. And in terms of grinding a stone, we don't have, at least in Iranian Zagros, we know evidence of grinding a stone during the Epipaleolithic period. And in terms of nature of occupation, no. Still during the Epipaleolithic, we see that cave site, rock shelter, and open air site, they are still under occupation, exactly like the other period of Paleolithic. So in the early Neolithic, at least from the 10th millennium BC, we see that the new places are actually under occupation, Sheikhi Abad, Chogha Golan, and so on. So, but let me talk about a little bit more about the lithic. So yeah, in some cases, like mixed, yeah, for example, unique, let's say those, for example, blade or they were used by punch technique directly from single platform, for example, cores. They were still, you know, in use during this transitional period, but they were actually became less and less during later period, at least in the 8th millennium, and they were mostly replaced by those very typical bullet-shaped core. That's why we can talk about a sort of technotypological change in the lithic technology. To some, but you know better than me, I believe that change in the lithic, at least in the Zagros, was so slow. That's why it was called by Kozlowski as a wild or a stable, let's say, a stable region in terms of lithic technology. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to add something here, Bogdana, about the Epipal Neo transition?
No, for me it was just very interesting to see this, that
yeah.
Also that like in forest they are also about the longer occupations in cave and how transition and really takes.
Yeah.
But it is really.
Yeah, I believe in terms of forest, also my Iranian colleagues who are working in forest in Central Zagros, they believe that the Neolithization happened actually in that area, and it was introduced from the Central Zagros. But for me, it is actually for those like me who are focused on the Central Zagros, this can be okay. So I should be in agreement with this idea, but I'm not. I believe that thus, you know, we have a sort of a core zone in that area as well, because based on the new evidence that we know from late Epipaleolithic, in particular, that site you mentioned, excavated by Iranian Japanese archaeologists in close to Persepolis. So we should actually, if we have more evidence, we should track this kind of transition from like the Central Zagros. But depends how can we actually, we try to track the transition of during by our Danish Iranian project, but we didn't find actually to know. So because I believe that we are dealing with, you know, with so many innovation, you know, in the Zagros, in these creative millennia.
Because the sites belong to
yeah. So this certainty is very important based on new evidence. We at least in some cases, in for example, Kritik Tepe, Chemkehiyuk, and Bonjuklu Tarla, based on the radiocarbon, we have the initial level dated to the end of the 11th millennium BC, which is very important. And based on from the lithic technology, we see that, for example, we have some geometry, but we don't have the same thing in the Iranian Zagros. What happened? Why we don't have the earliest site in that region? maybe, who knows, maybe some actually migration happened because we have an earlier site in the Iranian Zagros. Also, new evidence actually brings those previously believed gap between early Neolithic and late Epipaleolithic in the Iranian Zagros. But we don't know the exact termination, the end of the late Epipaleolithic, and whether the cold, dry, climatic event of the Younger Dryas actually happened in the region, how people responded to this. Did they abandon the region entirely to the lower level region? No, we don't know. Up to now, we don't have any evidence. At least for that, in that case, we need to go to the lowland in case of paleoclimatic evidence and to find if that area was favorable and if we have evidence datable to this climatic period.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Actually, what we can for sure can take away from after your lecture, after many new data, hearing all this combination and the summary of this highly dynamic field in archaeology. Actually, I think we can really summarize this now. Is that, you know, moving between lowlands and highlands is an important topic. And that the 9th millennium is the most important and exciting one for the Neolithic experts. So thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for your lecture. And I think we can continue discussing all, you know, further details now in our wine and water reception. So you're all invited for sure. And again, thank you very much, and goodbye also to the digital audience. We see each other again in autumn. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, let's stop. Stop.